Enough. The Baron's voice cut through the air like thunder, making the estate manager recoil a step. Hector's eyes, once vacant, now burned with suppressed fury. Here, who decides who deserves to be here is this house, and she has already been accepted by those who matter most. The young woman, huddled in the corner, raised her tear-streaked face, her gaze lost between fear and gratitude. The silence that followed weighed more than any words. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10, and tell us which city you're tuning in from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The golden green estate seemed to have forgotten how to smile. The wind blowing from the rolling hills of the countryside, once laden with the sweet scent of coffee plantations and the sound of workers' laughter, now only brought a chill that seeped into the cracks of the main house and into the souls of those who lived there. 2 years had passed, 2 long and drawn-out years since Baroness Esther had departed, and with her she took all the color and melody from that place. Baron Hector, a man who once had an easy laugh and a warm embrace, became a mere shell of himself. He spent his days locked in his study, surrounded by books he didn't read and accounts he barely glanced at. The only thing that still tethered him to the world was the window, from which he observed the green immensity of his lands and, most importantly, the small figure of his daughter, Beatrice. Bea, at 5 years old, was a miniature portrait of her mother, but without the light in her eyes. The girl drifted through the house like a little ghost, dressed in white, her blonde hair always tied with a ribbon that seemed to constrain more than adorn. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't throw tantrums. She simply existed, in a silence that hurt more than any weeping. Hector looked at her and saw the reflection of his own pain, his inability to fix what was broken. "It's been years since I last saw her smile," he said one night to the walls of his study, his voice hoarse, choked with a knot that never untangled. The household staff, who served him with an almost fearful loyalty, pretended not to hear, but felt the weight of that sadness in every corner. Joy had been forbidden, not by order, but by a mute decree of grief. It was on a morning of fine drizzle, one of those that leave the world grey and blurred, that a different figure appeared at the estate gate. She was a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, in a simple dress, faded by the sun and time. In her hands she carried a worn straw hat, and on her feet the dust of a long journey. She had sun-kissed skin and large, expressive brown eyes, which she kept lowered, as if not wanting to impose. She introduced herself as Lucy. Her voice was gentle, almost a whisper, and carried a country accent that sounded like an old melody. She had come to ask for work, anything. She said she had good hands for the fields, for the kitchen, for whatever was needed. Hector received her on the veranda, his posture rigid, his expression closed. He assessed Lucy from head to toe, a habit of someone accustomed to measuring the worth of things and people with a single glance. He saw her calloused hands, her worn clothes, her almost exaggerated humility. In other times, he might have sent her away without a second thought. The estate already had more than enough staff, but something about her demeanor, perhaps the contained sweetness in her voice, or the honesty in the gaze she finally raised to meet his, stopped him. It was a gaze that didn't beg for pity, only a chance. He remembered what the town doctor had said about Bea. The girl needs life around her. Baron, someone who doesn't carry the same weight as you. There's a position to care for my daughter, he said, the words coming out drier than he intended. The work is simple. Just stay with her. Don't leave her alone. He gave no more details. He didn't speak of the sadness, the silence, the laughter that no longer existed. He simply turned his back and ordered one of the older housekeepers, Mrs. Higgins, to show Lucy where she would stay. For him, she was just another employee, a futile attempt like all the others. Expensive toys, new dresses. He had even bought a pony for his daughter. Nothing worked. What could an unknown country girl do? He had no hope, but despair sometimes bears a striking resemblance to it. Lucy was led to a small, simple room in the back of the main house, near the kitchen. The scent of firewood and freshly brewed coffee welcomed her in a way the Baron's cold gaze couldn't. Mrs. Higgins, a woman of few words and wrinkles that told stories, explained the rules. Speak softly, make no noise, don't contradict the master, and above all, don't touch on the past. The girl is delicate, the old cook said, as she handed Lucy a clean uniform. Her mother. She was the joy of this house. When the light goes out, it takes a long time to get used to the dark. Lucy merely nodded. She understood darkness. Life had never been easy for her. She lost her parents early, was raised by an aunt who barely had enough for herself, and from a young age learned that work was the only thing that could guarantee the next day's bread. But despite everything, she carried within herself a seed of stubborn resolve, a desire to see things bloom. She looked out the small window of her new room. In the distance, she saw a girl in a white dress, standing in the middle of the garden, looking at a rose as if she didn't know what to do with it. Lucy's heart ached. She didn't know the depth of pain that house held, but she felt, with an intuition that came from the earth, that her work there would be much more than just watching over a child. It would be an attempt to plant a flower in a withered garden. Lucy's first days at Golden Green Estate were like walking on tiptoes in a church. The silence was so dense, it seemed to have a physical presence, and her every step echoed through the long, dark wooden corridors. She learned to move with the lightness of a shadow, respecting the quietude that was the unwritten law of that place. Beatrice, little B, was her focus. The girl didn't reject her, but she didn't accept her either. She simply ignored her. As if Lucy were just another piece of furniture in the house's decor. Lucy didn't force it. She sat at a respectful distance in the playroom, while the girl stared fixedly out the window, or accompanied her on her solitary walks through the garden, without saying a word. Lucy observed. She saw how Bee touched the petals of flowers without feeling their texture, how she looked at the sky without seeing the clouds. She was a child trapped within a bubble of sadness. Then, Lucy began to act with small gestures. One day, while Bee was sitting on the veranda, Lucy appeared with 2 rag dolls she had sewn herself during the night, using fabric scraps she found in the laundry room. They were simple dolls, with wool hair and button eyes, but made with a care that was almost a prayer. She didn't hand them to the girl. She simply sat them beside her on the bench and began to talk to them, creating a little story about 2 sisters who wanted to find an enchanted garden. Bee didn't turn round, but Lucy noticed that the girl's little head tilted slightly in the direction of her voice. It was the first sign. The next day, Lucy brought a ball of colorful yarn and began to braid it, making little bracelets and necklaces for the dolls. Every now and then, she would let a thread escape and roll near Bee's feet. The girl looked at the colorful thread on the floor, hesitated, but didn't pick it up. Lucy didn't insist. She collected her thread and continued playing alone. She was planting seeds of curiosity, watering them with patience, waiting for something to sprout. Gradually, the invisible barrier began to crack. Bede started following Lucy with her gaze. She watched as Lucy tidied her room, softly humming a country tune, a lullaby her own mother used to sing to her. It was a sound so different from the heavy silence of the house that it seemed to come from another world. One day, Lucy was sitting on the grass, combing one of the doll's wool hair with an improvised comb made of twigs. Bee approached slowly, step by step, and sat down a short distance away, hugging her knees. She stayed there, just watching, her blue eyes, once so dull, now with a spark of interest. The big moment happened on a sunny afternoon, about 2 weeks after Lucy's arrival. Baron Hector was, as usual, in his study, trying to concentrate on some papers, but his mind wandered. The sound of the wind was the only noise, until something different broke the monotony. It was a soft sound, almost a murmur, coming from downstairs. Lucy's voice. He stood up and went to the door, curious. The voice was coming from Bee's room. He descended the stairs in silence, his heart beating a little faster, without him knowing why. He stopped in the hallway, hidden by the shadow of a pillar, and peeked through the slightly open door. The scene he witnessed left him paralyzed. Lucy was sitting on the floor, and Bee, for the first time, was sitting very close to her. Lucy had a blade of grass in her mouth and was blowing it, producing a thin, funny whistle. She would pause, look at Bee with a mischievous smile, and blow again. Bee watched, her little mouth agape, fascinated. Lucy then picked up a dandelion she had gathered from the garden and held it in front of the girl. They say if you blow really hard and all the little seeds fly away, a wish comes true, she whispered, her voice full of secrets. What is your wish, little flower? Bee didn't answer. She just stretched out her tiny hand and touched the delicate flower. Lucy smiled and blew the dandelion. The white seeds flew around the room, glancing in the sunlight streaming through the window, looking like tiny fairies. And then it happened. A sound Hector thought he would never hear again. A pure crystalline sound that seemed to have been stored away for an eternity. Beatrice's laughter. It wasn't a loud, boisterous laugh. It was a short, childish giggle that bubbled up from within her like a spring finally finding a crack to gush through. That sound traveled through the hallway like a shock wave. In the kitchen, Mrs. Higgins, who was peeling potatoes, dropped her knife. The other servants stopped what they were doing, eyes wide, looking at each other as if they had witnessed a miracle. And for Hector, leaning against the pillar, it was exactly that. His daughter's laughter hit him squarely, tearing down a wall he didn't even know was still standing within his chest. His eyes welled up, and he had to hold back a sound. In that moment, Lucy ceased to be just an employee. She was the woman who'd achieved the impossible, bringing spring back to his daughter's winter. Bee's laughter was like the first rain after a long drought. It didn't solve all problems at once, but it moistened the earth, awakened dormant seeds, and brought a scent of hope to the air. From that day on, Hector changed. He remained the Baron, the serious man who owned those lands, but the observer within him awakened. He began to discreetly look for Lucy and Bee. He pretended to go to the library, which had a window overlooking the garden, or went down to the kitchen with the excuse of getting a glass of water, just to hear the sounds that now came from the house. And the sounds were many. They were Bee's hurried little footsteps chasing Lucy across the lawn, both laughing as if sharing a secret game only they understood. It was Lucy's voice telling stories, no longer in whispers, but with intonation, imitating animal and witch voices, making Bee give little squills of fright and delight. It was the sound of nursery rhymes Lucy taught, simple melodies that intertwined with the curtains and furniture of the house. chasing away the ghosts of silence. Hector watched his daughter transform before his eyes. The pale, apathetic girl gave way to a child flushed by the sun, with often messy hair and hands smudged with dirt. Bee now brought flowers indoors, not to put them in vases, but to adorn Lucy's hair, or to make flower soup in a toy pot. She started talking again, not just answering questions, but telling things, asking questions, chattering like a child her age should. The main house, once a mausoleum, began to feel like a home again. The Baron felt a complex mixture of gratitude, relief, and a pang of something he couldn't name. It was almost a jealousy, not of Lucy, but of the ease with which she had managed to access his daughter's heart, a place he, the father himself, could no longer reach. He saw the way Bee looked at Lucy, an adoration and trust that were a balm and a stab at the same time. He kept his distance, afraid that his presence, with all the burden of sadness he carried, might break the spell. One morning, he was on his horse, inspecting a more distant part of the plantation. From afar, he spotted two figures near the stream that cut through the property. It was Lucy and Bee. Lucy was crouched at the water's edge, washing some clothes, scrubbing them vigorously on a smooth stone. Bee, sitting on the bank, played with pebbles, throwing them into the water and laughing at the sound they made. The morning sun shone on them, creating a scene that looked painted, full of light and peace. Hector stopped his horse behind a grove of trees, just watching. Lucy finished washing a small nightdress of Bee's, wrung it out, and placed it in a basket beside her. She turned to the girl and smiled. "Be careful not to get your dress wet, my angel," she said, her voice filled with an almost palpable tenderness. Bee then stood up, walked with her hesitant little steps along the uneven bank, and as she approached Lucy, did something that made Hector's heart stop for a second. The girl clung to Lucy's legs, hugging her with all the strength of her tiny arms, and rested her face against the young woman's simple dress. And then, her voice muffled by the fabric, she uttered a single word, a word that hadn't been spoken aloud in that house for 2 years. "Mama." The word floated in the air, small, yet with the weight of a world. Lucy froze. Her arms, which were on their way to caress the girl's hair, stopped in mid-air. She looked at the blonde head resting against her, and her eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and panic. She didn't know what to do, what to say. She just stood there, motionless, feeling the child's tight embrace. Hidden among the trees, Hector felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. That word, "Mama," to hear it from his daughter's mouth, directed at another woman, was like having the scar of his loss reopened with a sharp blade. It hurt deeply. But, at the same time, beneath the pain, there was something else, a strange and overwhelming comfort. His daughter was feeling safe enough, loved enough, to call someone Mama again. The pain was his, the man who lost his wife. The comfort was for the father, who was reconnecting with his daughter. He pulled hard on the reins of his horse, turning the animal abruptly and riding away before anyone saw him. He galloped aimlessly, the wind whipping his face, trying to organize the storm of feelings that had formed within him. The image of Bee hugging Lucy, the sound of that word, wouldn't leave his head. He realized with a frightening clarity that the presence of that simple country girl in his house had become indispensable, and that frightened him more than the 2 years of silence and loneliness he had endured. The word "Mama," spoken by Bee, marked a turning point not only for the girl, but for everyone in the main house. For Lucy, it was a shock. She gently disentangled herself from Bee's embrace, and, kneeling in front of her, said in the softest voice she could manage, "I'm Lucy, my love. I take care of you." But Bee just smiled, as if the name didn't matter, only the feeling. Lucy understood that for such a small child, Mama wasn't a name, it was a function, that of giving love, security, and affection, and she was doing that. From that day on, she redoubled her care, but always with a tiny prick of worry in her heart. She was just a servant. What would the master think of that? Hector, for his part, began to deal with his conflicting feelings in a different way. Fear and jealousy gave way to a genuine curiosity about Lucy. Who was this woman who, with such simple gestures, had achieved what no one else could? He began to break down the barrier of distance he himself had imposed. The dry orders, given through other servants, were replaced by direct approaches. He would find her in the hallways, and, instead of just passing by, he would stop. "The weather looks like it's going to turn," he would say, looking out the window, his voice a little rusty from disuse in trivial conversations. "It's true, sir. It's the smell of rain coming from the hills," Lucy would reply, always with a respectful gaze, but without the fearful submission from before. There was a calmness about her that intrigued him. The conversations were always short, about the weather, the harvest, Bee's health, but for Hector, they were more than that. They were an excuse to hear her voice, to see the way her eyes shone when she spoke of plants or some mischief of the girl. He discovered that Lucy had a deep knowledge of the land, learned not from books, but from practice. She knew which tea was good for a cough, which leaf relieved an insect bite, and the soil was good for planting. These were simple bits of wisdom, but they revealed a connection to life that he had lost. At night, the silence in the Baron's study was often broken. He would find himself leaving the door ajar, hoping to hear some sound coming from downstairs. Often it was Lucy's voice singing a lullaby to put Bee to sleep. The melodies were sweet and sad, speaking of stars and guardian angels. Hector would close his eyes and let himself be carried away by that voice, which seemed to stitch together the loose pieces of his soul. On other nights, when he went down to the main parlor after everyone had retired, he would find her, sitting by the fireplace, using the light of the flames to mend one of Bee's little dresses or to embroider a flower on a handkerchief. She would be so engrossed in her work that she wouldn't even notice his presence. Standing in the shadow of the stairs, he observed her, the needle moving up and down with delicate precision, her calloused hands moving with unexpected grace. In those moments, she didn't look like a servant. She looked like the guardian of that house, watching over his daughter's sleep, mending not just fabrics, but the very fabric of that family. A new and dangerous feeling began to grow in his chest, a comfort in her presence, a silent admiration that bordered on affection. But he was Baron Hector, and she, a country girl. The conventions of the time, the memory of his deceased wife, his own pride, all created a chasm between them. As this silent rapprochement occurred, the other inhabitants of the house were not blind. Whispers began to spread like wildfire. The servants, who once viewed Lucy with a mixture of pity and admiration, now looked at her with suspicion and a hint of envy. "The newcomer is bewitching the master," one laundress would say to another. "Did you see the way he looks at her?" the coachman would whisper to the gardener. The one who felt this change most was Anselm, the estate manager, a vain, middle-aged man who had always considered himself the Baron's right-hand man. He harbored the hope that, over time, his position would become even more important, perhaps even gaining some personal advantage from the master's widower status. Lucy's arrival, and especially the attention she received, were a direct threat to his plans. He saw her as a schemer, a clever opportunist who used the girl to climb the social ladder. Anselm began to subtly undermine Lucy. He gave her the most difficult tasks, criticized her work in front of others, made malicious comments disguised as jokes. "Be careful, Lucy. The Baron is a good man, but one shouldn't mistake kindness for opportunity," he would say, with a false smile on his lips. Lucy felt the venom, but didn't retaliate. She simply lowered her head and continued her work, focused on B and on not causing problems. She knew she was vulnerable there, that her position depended entirely on the goodwill of a man she barely knew. What she didn't know was that this man, Baron Hector, was more aware of what was happening around him than everyone imagined. He pretended not to hear the whispers, but every malicious word spoken about Lucy was like a small stone thrown at himself. The peace she had brought to his home was being threatened, and he felt that soon he would have to choose a side. The tension at Golden Green Estate could be cut with a knife. The change in Baron Hector's behavior was evident to all, and Anselm, the estate manager, felt his power and influence slipping through his fingers. The gratitude Hector felt for Lucy was transforming into something more, a protection, a care he didn't dedicate to any other employee, and that, for Anselm, was intolerable. He decided it was time to act more directly, to put the presumptuous country girl in her rightful place. The perfect opportunity arose on a rainy afternoon. The rain fell heavily outside, turning the estate paths into rivers of mud and confining everyone inside the main house. The air was heavy, laden with humidity and premonitions. Lucy was in the main parlor with B. The girl was drawing on a piece of paper with charcoal, while Lucy, sitting on the floor beside her, told a story about a raindrop traveling the world. The sound of rain on the window and Lucy's gentle voice created an atmosphere of peace and coziness. It was at this moment that Anselm entered the room. He had just come from the Baron's study, where he had had a veiled discussion with Hector about some estate expenses. Frustrated and irritated, he took out his anger on the first person he saw, and that person was Lucy. "What do you think you're doing?" he said, his voice loud and harsh, shattering the calm of the room. "Be coward," frightened by the tone. Lucy quickly stood up, instinctively placing herself between Anselm and the girl. "Mr. Anselm." "I was just looking after little B," she replied, her voice firm but respectful. "Looking after her or taking advantage?" he retorted, approaching her with a look of contempt. "Do you think no one notices your little game? You came from nowhere, a nobody, and now you think you own the house. You whisper with the girl, filling her head with nonsense, all to gain the master's sympathy." Lucy's eyes filled with tears, but she held firm. "You are mistaken, sir. My only interest is the girl's well-being." "Well-being?" He laughed, a cruel sound that echoed in the room. "You're a schemer, an opportunist using an orphaned child to climb the social ladder. Do you think the Baron will fall for your sweet talk? He is a man of position, of family. He would never look at someone like you, a pauper. You are merely soiling the reputation of this house, bringing shame to the family name." Each word was like a slap in Lucy's face. She trembled, not from fear, but from humiliation. She looked at B, who was now crying softly, frightened by the argument. Lucy's heart broke. She could endure the insults, but she couldn't bear to see the girl suffering because of her. "Please, sir, speak softly." "The girl is frightened," she pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. "Don't tell me what to do." Anselm shouted, raising his hand as if to physically reprimand her. "Enough." Hector's voice rang out like a gunshot in the ensuing silence. He stood at the parlor door, his expression somber, fists clenched. No one had seen him arrive. He had heard everything. Anselm froze, his arm still in the air, his face instantly paling. Hector walked slowly to the center of the room, his heavy steps echoing on the wooden floor. He didn't look at Anselm. His eyes went straight to Lucy and to his daughter, who was sobbing in the corner. He saw the fear and humiliation in Lucy's eyes, and a cold, controlled fury took hold of him. He turned to Anselm, his gaze so cutting that the estate manager recoiled a step. "Who do you think you are to speak to her like that in this house?" Hector's voice was low, but laden with an authority Anselm had never witnessed before. "Baron, I was just—" the manager stammered, trying to justify himself. "This woman. She's taken advantage of your kindness." "Silence," Hector ordered. "The only person taking advantage of anything here is you. Taking advantage of my pain, my grief, to wield a power that does not belong to you. This woman," he said, pointing to Lucy, "brought something back to this house that you, with all your calculated loyalty, never could. Life." He approached Anselm until he was inches from his face. "Here. Who decides who deserves to be here and who doesn't is not you. It is this house. And she," he paused, glancing at Lucy, "has already been accepted by those who matter most." The silence that followed was absolute. Anselm, humiliated and defeated, merely lowered his head. Hector looked at Lucy. Her eyes were tear-filled, but she met his gaze, and in that look they shared an understanding that went beyond words. It was a mixture of gratitude, recognition, an alliance forged in the midst of the storm. Lucy simply inclined her head, a gesture worth more than 1,000 thanks. "Withdraw, Anselm," Hector said, without taking his eyes off Lucy, "and do not address her again unless it is to discuss strictly necessary matters. Was I clear?" "Yes, sir," Anselm mumbled, before turning and leaving the room, leaving behind a trail of tension and a new reality. Hector finally looked at his daughter. He knelt, opened his arms, and for the first time in 2 years, Bray ran into his embrace. He held her tightly, feeling her trembling little body against his chest, and looked over her shoulder at Lucy. It was the first public gesture of defense, the first time he broke his armor of grief to protect his family's newfound peace. And in that moment, the three of them, the Baron, the country girl, and the child, became in fact the heart of that house. The storm outside the main house passed, but the storm that Hector's reprimand caused in Anselm was only just beginning to brew. However, within the walls of the main parlor, an unprecedented calm settled. The Baron's public defense was a watershed moment. For the other servants, it was a clear and unequivocal sign. Lucy was not just another employee. She was under the master's personal protection. The whispers diminished, replaced by cautious respect. For Lucy, it was the first time in a long while that she felt safe, validated. The look of gratitude she exchanged with Hector that day created an invisible yet powerful bond between them. The dynamic between the three subtly shifted. Hector, after hugging Bee and calming her, looked at Lucy and said, his voice still grave, but without the coldness of before, "Take her to her room. Make her a warm tea." It wasn't an order, it was a request. And implied within it was a, "Take care of her, as you always do." Lucy nodded, and, taking Bede's little hand, led the girl upstairs, feeling the Baron's gaze following them until they disappeared down the hallway. From that day on, the interaction between Hector and Lucy gained a new layer. The trivial conversations about the weather gave way to more meaningful dialogues. He began to ask about her childhood, about the stories she told Bee, about the songs she sang. He discovered that she was an orphan, that life had been hard, but that she never lost a certain sweetness, a resilience he deeply admired. One evening, he found her in the garden, under the moonlight, picking lemon balm leaves for Bee's tea. "It helps her sleep peacefully," she explained, without him having to ask. He stood there in silence for a moment, just observing the care with which she selected each leaf. "My wife, Esther. She also believed in the power of herbs," he said, his voice low, almost a secret. It was the first time he had mentioned the late Baroness's name to Lucy. Lucy stopped what she was doing and looked at him. She saw the ancient pain in the Baron's eyes and felt immense compassion. "Things that come from the earth have the strength of life, sir. They help us heal from within," she replied, with her simple wisdom. Hector felt a comfort in that phrase, a permission to feel the pain without letting it consume him. In that moment, under the starry sky, they were not the Baron and the servant. They were just a man and a woman, sharing a moment of quietude and understanding. This new closeness, however, did not go unnoticed. Anselm, although publicly restrained, was corroded by envy and resentment. He began to work in the shadows, spreading venom more subtly. He no longer spoke ill of Lucy directly, but planted seeds of doubt among the field workers and the merchants in the neighboring town. "The Baron isn't himself anymore. He seems bewitched," he would say, with a false air of concern. "That young woman, there's something strange about her. Ever since she arrived, the master has been distracted, neglecting business." The rumors began to leak beyond the estate gates. The story of a widowed and reclusive baron who suddenly became enchanted by a country girl was fodder for gossip in the small town. Hector's name, once synonymous with respect and power, was now whispered with malice in the corners of the general store and at the church door. People began to look at Lucy differently when she went to the village to buy something for the house. She felt the curious glances, the malicious smiles, the whispers that ceased when she approached. Lucy began to feel the weight of that situation. She, who only wanted a peaceful place to work and care for little Bee, found herself at the center of a hurricane. The gratitude she felt for Hector mixed with guilt. She felt that her presence, which had brought joy back to Bee, was now bringing shame and problems to the girl's father. She tried to distance herself, to be more discreet, to avoid the nightly encounters in the garden or the conversations in the parlor. But it was difficult. Bede wanted her nearby all the time, and Hector himself seemed to seek her company, as if her presence were an anchor in his sea of loneliness. Lucy's breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon. The town judge's family came to visit the estate, something that hadn't happened in years. Hector received them with his usual formality, but was visibly more relaxed than usual. Bee, dressed in her best dress, even risked a shy smile for the visitors. Lucy served coffee in the parlor, keeping her head down, trying to be invisible. But the judge's wife, a sharp-tongued woman with a keen eye, didn't let her go unnoticed. "So this is the famous caregiver," the woman said, with an intonation that made it clear she meant something else. "We've heard much about your talent with the child." The venom in her voice was palpable. Hector tensed, and Lucy felt her face burn with shame. She merely murmured "excuse me," and quickly retreated to the kitchen, but could hear the woman's snicker echoing behind her. That night, Lucy couldn't sleep. The judge's wife's words, the looks in town, the whispers on the estate, all merged in her mind, forming a painful conclusion. She was the source of the problem. As long as she was there, the Baron's reputation would be at stake. Bee's happiness was what mattered most to her, but at what cost? Would it cost the honor of the man who defended her, who treated her with dignity? Her heart was in pieces. She loved that girl as if she were her own, and felt for the Baron a gratitude and affection she dared not name. But her conscience weighed heavily. She couldn't be the reason for their shame. With silent tears wetting her pillow, she made the most difficult decision of her life. The decision to leave settled in Lucy's heart like a cold stone. Every laugh from Bea, every gentle look from Hector now felt like a farewell, making everything even more painful. She spent the following days memorizing the details of that house that had become her home. The way the morning sun illuminated the hallway, the smell of coffee brewed by Mrs. Higgins, the sound of Bea's footsteps running to hug her. She was preparing to tear a part of herself away. She waited for a night when a heavy rain lashed the estate, knowing that the darkness and the sound of the storm would help conceal her departure. After Bea fell asleep, Lucy stood by the girl's bed for a long time. She stroked her blonde hair, adjusted her blanket, and placed a soft kiss on her forehead, a kiss that carried all the love and pain of her goodbye. "Be happy, my little flower," she whispered, swallowing the cry that threatened to erupt. In her small room, she packed the small, worn bundle with which she had arrived. She had almost nothing to take, just a few pieces of clothing and the 2 rag dolls she had made for Bea. She left them on the girl's bed, a last silent gift. The hardest part was writing the letter. Lucy barely knew how to read and write. The little she learned was from a priest in her village. She found a piece of wrapping paper and a stub of a pencil. The lamplight flickered, dancing over her trembling hands. The handwriting was uncertain, the letters uneven, but the words came from the depths of her soul. She didn't know how to use the difficult words of books, so she used the ones she knew, the ones that were true to her. "Dear Baron," she began, "I ask for forgiveness for leaving without speaking, but my heart won't let me stay. I came to this house to help and ended up bringing trouble. People say bad things, and I don't want your name and little Bea's name to be stained because of me. You defended me and gave me respect, and that is why I have to go, to protect you from the malice of others. I will never forget the girl's laughter and your kindness. I pray that God watches over you. Goodbye, Lucy." She folded the paper carefully and left it on Hector's desk in his study, where she knew he would find it in the morning. She took one last look at the main house, a dark silhouette against the stormy sky, and felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces. With her bundle on her back and a heavy soul, she leapt through the back door and disappeared into the rainy night, aimlessly, carrying with her only the memories and the pain of leaving behind the only family she had ever known. The next morning, Lucy's absence was noticed immediately. Bea woke up and didn't find her beside her bed, as usual. She called for her, her little voice echoing through the silent house. Mrs. Higgins went to see what was happening and, finding Lucy nowhere, felt a tightening in her chest. The news quickly reached the Baron, who was in his study, trying to ignore the strange feeling that something was wrong. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice controlled, but his eyes already searching for something. Anything that would explain the disappearance. It was then that he saw it. The folded piece of paper on his desk. He picked it up, his hands suddenly cold. He recognized the simple handwriting, the uneven words, and his heart sank before he even finished reading. Every word of the letter was a stab to his pride and his heart. "People say bad things, ... single quotes. I don't want your name to be stained, ... single quotes. To protect you, ... single quotes." He crumpled the paper in his hand, an impotent rage growing within him. At the whole town, with their poisonous tongues, but above all, rage at himself, for not having realized the weight she carried, for not having protected her enough, for having let her feel that she needed to flee to save him. At that moment, Bee entered the study, her little eyes red from crying. "Daddy, where's Lucy?" "She's gone." Seeing his daughter's despair was the last straw. The Baron's old pride, the armor of indifference who had worn for so long, completely dissolved. What did the opinion of others matter? What did reputation, name, conventions matter when his daughter's happiness was at stake, when his own newfound peace was slipping through his fingers? He looked at the crumpled letter in his hand. She had left to protect him. Now it was his turn to fight for her. Without a second thought, he stood up, the decision etched on his face. "She'll be back, my daughter. I'll bring her back," he said. With a conviction that surprised even himself, he strode down the stairs, ignoring the curious glances of the servants. "Prepare my horse, now," he ordered the stableman, his voice sounding with the authority of a general going into battle. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray and the ground covered in mud. He didn't care. He mounted his strongest horse, Windstorm, and galloped off, following the muddy roads, not knowing exactly where he was going, guided only by an image in his mind, his daughter's laughter, and by the certainty that he could not, by any means, let that sound disappear from his life again. Hector's ride was a race against time and against himself. The sound of Windstorm's hooves sinking into the mud was the soundtrack of his despair. Every puddle of water that splashed on his face was like a reminder of the previous night's storm and the storm in his own chest. He had no plan, only one goal: to find Lucy. Where could a poor young woman, alone and on foot, go? The main road, which led to town, was the most obvious path. He followed it, his heart beating erratically, his eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of her. The world seemed gray and faded, just as he felt inside. He passed some farm workers heading to the fields, slow carts laden with provisions. He asked everyone, his voice urgent. The Baron's imposing posture, momentarily forgotten. "Have you seen a young woman?" Young, in a simple dress, carrying a bundle. Some looked at him strangely, others shook their heads negatively. No one had seen her. Frustration began to mix with panic. What if he lost her forever? The image of Bee, with tear-filled eyes, returned to his mind. The image of Lucy, smiling as she blew the dandelion. The image of the main house, which had come back to life and now, without her, seemed doomed to plunge back into darkness. He couldn't allow it. He remembered the conversations he had with her. She had mentioned once the village where she was born, a small place, nestled in the mountains, a day's walk from there. Perhaps she was returning to her origins, to the only place she knew. It was a hunch, a gamble, but it was all he had. He changed course, leaving the main road and taking a shortcut, a narrower and rougher trail that cut through the hills. The journey was difficult. The trail was slippery because of the rain, and in several stretches he had to dismount and lead the horse by the reins. His fine leather boots, made for walking on the polished floors of the manor, were now covered in mud. His clothes, impeccably aligned, were creased and dirty. But none of that mattered. With each step, he shed a little more of Baron Hector and became simply Hector, a man fighting not to lose what was most precious to him. As he rode, his mind was a whirlwind. He replayed the last few months, Lucy's arrival, Bee's transformation, his own transformation. He realized how blind and selfish he had been. He had hidden in his grief, allowed sadness to define his life and his daughter's. And when the light finally returned, in the form of that gentle-voiced country girl, he passively accepted it, as if it were his right. He hadn't realized the sacrifice she was making, the vulnerable position she was in, the silent battles she fought every day against prejudice and malice. He defended her from Anselm, yes, but it was an impulsive act, a reaction. He didn't truly protect her. He didn't make her feel safe enough to believe that her place was there, beside them, regardless of what others said. Her letter was proof of his failure. She left out of honor, out of loyalty to him, thinking she was doing the right thing, and he let her go. The guilt weighed on his shoulders as much as the fatigue of the journey. After hours that seemed an eternity, he reached a higher point on the trail, from where he could see the valley below, and then he saw her. A small figure walking slowly at the edge of a field, near a stream that meandered through the landscape. Even from afar, he recognized her. It was Lucy. She was standing still, looking at the flowing water, as if gathering strength to cross to the other side, to leave the world of the estate behind once and for all. Hector's heart leaped. He spurred his horse, descending the slope with hasty caution, the fear that she would disappear again propelling him. He approached in silence, stopping the horse a few yards away. She didn't hear him arrive, lost in her own thoughts. The sky was cloudy. The pale daylight enveloped her in an aura of melancholy. She seemed so small, so alone in that vast green field. He dismounted, his legs a little shaky from the ride and the emotion. He took a few steps towards her, the sound of his steps on the wet grass finally making her turn. Her eyes widened in surprise, in fright. She couldn't believe what she saw. The Baron, there, covered in mud, his hair disheveled by the wind, his face marked by worry. He stopped a short distance away. The silence between them was dense, laden with everything that hadn't been said. And then he called her. Not young woman, not you. He used her name, a name that, he realized, he had rarely pronounced aloud. Lucy. The words sounded different on his lips. It wasn't the voice of the master. It was the voice of a man who had ridden for hours, driven by the urgency of his heart. And in that single call, Lucy felt the entire barrier she had built around herself begin to crumble. Her name, Lucy, hung in the air between them, laden with a meaning neither of them expected. She stood paralyzed, her bundle of clothes almost slipping from her hands. To see Baron Hector there in front of her, so different from the imposing and distant figure she knew, was surreal. He seemed more human, more vulnerable. His gaze was not one of anger, but of a silent plea. "Sir," she whispered, her voice faltering. "What are you doing here? You shouldn't." "I should," he interrupted her, his voice firm but full of emotion. He took another step, narrowing the distance between them. "I read your letter, Lucy, and you were wrong. About everything." Lucy lowered her head, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I just did what was right. For you, for the girl, right?" he questioned, a tone of anguish in his voice. "Was it right to leave my daughter crying, calling for you? Was it right to let this house become a silent tomb again? Was it right to leave me, to leave us, without you?" The last part came out almost as a murmur, a confession he hadn't planned to make. He moved even closer, until he could see every tear that streamed down her face. "You wrote that your presence was harming my reputation." "What reputation, Lucy?" "That of a bitter and lonely man, locked in his own pain." "You didn't harm anything. You healed. You've brought back something that no gold, no land, no baron's name can buy. You brought back my daughter's laughter. You've brought peace back to my house, to my life." Lucy was openly weeping now, a silent cry, like someone who had suffered for a long time without allowing herself a complaint. His words hit her like waves, breaking down her defenses, washing away the guilt she felt. "People, what will they say?" she managed to ask. her concern for his honor still present. And then Hector did something that sealed the transformation of that moment. He, the Baron, the man whose posture was always erect and proud, bowed his head before her. It was not a bow of servant to master, but a gesture of deep humility, of recognition. He gently took her hand, the same hand calloused by work that he had so often observed from afar. Her skin was rough against his, but the contact sent a warmth that coursed through his entire body. "Let them say what they want," he said, looking into her eyes, the entire world seeming to disappear around them. "For 2 years I lived caring about the past, about the shadows, about conventions, and I almost lost the present. I almost lost the chance to see my daughter happy again. I will not make the same mistake." He squeezed her hand tighter. "I didn't come here as a baron to order his servant to return. I came here as a father, asking, pleading, for the woman who saved his daughter not to abandon him. I came as a man, asking you to stay." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. There were no more barriers between them. There was no master and servant, rich and poor. There was only a man and a woman in a field under a cloudy sky, deciding the future of 3 lives. "Stay, Lucy," he repeated. His voice choked. "Not as a servant. Stay as one who belongs here, as one who belongs to us. Bee needs you. And I do too." The final confession hung in the air, fragile and powerful. Lucy looked at his face, at the eyes that were no longer cold and distant, but now looked at her with a tenderness and a need that mirrored her own. She realized that fleeing was not an act of honor, but of fear. Fear of accepting that she could, indeed, belong somewhere. That she deserved to be happy. Slowly, she nodded her head, unable to form words. A shy smile, wet with tears, bloomed on her lips. Hector felt a relief so profound, it was as if a weight he had carried for years had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He smiled back, a genuine smile, which reached his eyes and lit up his tired face. He didn't let go of her. He kept her hand in his, as if to make sure she wouldn't disappear. "Let's go home," he said. The word home, gaining a new and profound meaning. He helped her mount the horse, climbing on behind her, and together, on the same horse, they began the journey back, no longer as a baron and a country girl, but as 2 people who had found, in the simplicity of a field, the beginning of a new story. The return to Golden Green Estate was unlike any other arrival. The sun, which had been hidden all day, began to appear through the clouds, casting golden rays over the wet fields. It seemed like a good omen. Hector and Lucy rode in comfortable silence, the physical closeness on the horse breaking any remaining barriers. Lucy, sitting in front, could feel the warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was a feeling of protection and belonging she had never experienced. As the estate gates appeared on the horizon, the workers in the fields stopped what they were doing. The sight of the Baron arriving with the country girl on his horse was, at the very least, surprising. Whispers spread, but this time they were more of astonishment than malice. There was something in the posture of the 2, in the way Hector held the reins with Lucy in front of him, that commanded a new kind of respect. It was a silent declaration for anyone who cared to see. Upon reaching the main house, the first to see them was Bee. The girl was sitting on the veranda steps, her little face sad, waiting. As soon as she recognized Lucy's figure, her eyes lit up. "Lucy!" she cried, her voice full of relief and joy. Bee ran towards them the moment Hector dismounted and helped Lucy down. The girl didn't hesitate. She threw herself into Lucy's arms, hugging her with desperate strength. "You came back. I knew you would come back," she said between sobs of joy. Lucy knelt on the ground, not caring about the mud on her dress, and hugged the girl with the same intensity. "I came back, my flower. I came back, and I'm not leaving anymore," she whispered in Bees's ear, her own eyes tear-filled. Hector watched the scene, his heart overflowing with an emotion he could barely contain. The servants, including Mrs. Higgins and a scowling Anselm, came out onto the veranda, witnessing the reunion. Hector looked at them, his gaze sweeping over each face, and his expression left no doubt. This was his family. This was how things would be from now on. That night, the main house seemed to breathe again, a light and fresh air. Dinner was served at the large parlor table, and for the first time, it was not a silent, formal event. At Hector's request, a third place was set at the table, next to Bee. He invited Lucy to sit with them. She hesitated, feeling the stares of the other servants. But an encouraging nod from Hector made her sit down. Bee, between the two of them, chattered incessantly, telling everything she had done in Lucy's absence, holding her hand as if to make sure she wouldn't disappear again. After dinner, the three went to the main parlor. The fireplace was lit, and the fire crackled, filling the room with warmth and a cozy, orange light. Bee, tired from the day's excitement, fell asleep in Lucy's lap, who softly hummed a lullaby. Hector sat in a nearby armchair just watching. He saw the woman he loved, caring for the daughter he loved, and felt a peace so profound it felt like a dream. "She loves you very much," he said, his voice low, so as not to wake the girl. "And I love her," Lucy replied, looking at Bee's serene face. "She gave me a home, even when I didn't have one." "You gave us life back, Lucy," Hector said, standing up and approaching her. He knelt beside the sofa, bringing himself to her height. This house, these lands, they were nothing but a place of sad memories. You transformed them into a home again, a home for the three of us. He extended his hand and, with infinite delicacy, touched her face, wiping away a solitary tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. "Stay with me, Lucy. Stay and build this life by my side. Not as my daughter's caregiver, but as my companion. As the woman I love." The request, the declaration, everything came so naturally, so certainly, that Lucy had no doubts. She looked into his eyes and saw her future there, a future she never dared to dream of. She smiled and, leaning in, gave him a kiss. It was a soft, tender kiss, a silent promise of a new beginning. The wind entered through the windows, which now always stayed open, and brought with it the sound of the night in the countryside. But, for the first time in a very, very long time, the sound was not one of loneliness. It was a melody of hope. The golden green estate, which for so long lived under the shadow of grief, finally found its light again. And joy, once banished, returned to reign, no longer as a timid visitor, but as the true mistress of the house. So, did you enjoy how love and simplicity healed hearts at Golden Green Estate? Stories like Hector, Lucy, and Bees show us that happiness sometimes arrives gently and settles where we least expect it. If this journey touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new emotions. Give us that like that strengthens our work, and most importantly, comment below what you thought. Your opinion is the special seasoning in our stories. A big hug, and see you next time.